The summer of 1938 possessed an unsettling tranquility in Prague. The Vltava River flowed with the same familiar rhythm it always had, and the cafes lining the Rodney Avenue buzzed with cigarette smoke and conversations that lazily lingered in the air above the gentle clinking of coffee cups. At 27, I had just secured a position at a small newspaper that, against the odds, decided it could manage a foreign desk. My editor's initial assignment was delivered as both a jest and a heartfelt plea. Venture to the border towns. Bring back the whispers of the wind, the stories it carries. And so, I boarded a train bound for the Sudetenland, that uneven circle of mountains where German-speaking villages lay scattered like forgotten coins along the fringes of our republic. The train car carried the scent of coal and damp wool. Across from me, a baker's wife cradled a basket of poppy seed rolls in her lap, her gaze fixed on the passing scenery, as if expecting the landscape to suddenly reveal a hidden truth. At each stop, men in brown shirts confidently boarded and exited, their movements reflecting an unwavering belief that history would bend to their will. In Liberec, the air was noticeably crisper and thinner. Overnight, posters had appeared, stark profiles of Hitler's face, accompanied by the slogan, Heiman's Reich, a call to return to the Reich. I encountered a schoolteacher named Marta, who spoke Czech softly in German with a resentful undertone, as if both languages were sharp objects in her mouth. She led me through a marketplace where vendors kept a wary ear open for any sign of trouble. They claim we don't belong together, she said, gesturing toward the group of young men brandishing small swastika flags. Yet, I taught their children to read. I visited their mothers during the influenza outbreaks. We have been neighbors for generations. Now, the radio declares us enemies, and tragically, some people trust the radio more than their own eyes. As dusk settled, we stood near the town hall. The square teemed with a crowd. A local party leader's voice crackled to the loudspeakers, proclaiming self-determination and decrying the oppression of Germans by Prague. The people cheered, not necessarily because they had personally suffered as the speech suggested, but because cheering had become a form of self-preservation. Blend in, and perhaps you won't be noticed later. I scribbled notes, concealing my trembling hand within my coat to avoid drawing attention. Back in Prague, the government responded cautiously, and the newspapers engaged in endless, circular debates. We had treaties, allies, and the lingering memory of the Great War, still a fresh wound across Europe. Surely, no one desired another war. Yet, each week felt like a door quietly closing somewhere in the distance. September arrived with a faint aroma of apples and a growing sense of unease. Rumors swirled through the city like distant thunder. Germany was poised to invade. England and France would intervene. Or perhaps they wouldn't. In the newsroom, we listened to foreign broadcasts until our ears rang. I grew familiar with the timbre of Neville Chamberlain's voice, the way he sounded like a weary father negotiating for peace with a child who had already decided to break the toy. When the Munich conference was announced, my editor dispatched me to the Palace Square to observe the crowds gathering around a public radio. The night was chilly. Everyone leaned forward, their breath creating ghostly clouds in the darkness. Chamberlain spoke of peace for our time. Applause erupted in Munich and London. In Prague, the applause died before it even began. Around me, men removed their hats and stared at the pavement as if it had betrayed them. We had not been invited to the conference that determined our fate. Our fortifications, factories, and towns were handed over to Hitler in exchange for a flimsy paper promise. The radio hailed it as a triumph of diplomacy. The crowd in Prague saw it as abandonment. A week later, I returned to Marta's school in Liberec. She was packing books into crates. The day's lesson, half erased, still remained on the chalkboard. That morning, a German officer had arrived with a polite smile and a list of changes. The Czech curriculum would be abolished. The portraits in classrooms would be replaced. The school would remain open, but it would no longer be hers. "We're told to be calm," she said, tying a string around a bundle of maps. "They say this is only about borders, about language rights. But when someone enters your home and begins measuring the walls, it's not for a friendly visit." On the train back to Prague, an old man across the aisle wept silently. He showed me a photograph of his son, in uniform. He fought for this republic in 1918, he said. What do I tell him now? Winter arrived early that year. In March 1939, I awoke to the low rumble of engines and the sharp sound of boots on cobblestones. German troops were entering Prague, not as guests or protectors of minorities, but as conquerors. The city seemed to hold its breath. People stood in doorways with folded arms, more weary than surprised. Some offered flowers. Some spat. Most simply watched, as observing was safer than expressing a visible emotion. Hitler arrived at the castle in the rain. I stood at the edge of Hradkany Square with other reporters, my notebook damp. The flags changed before our very eyes, and with them, something shifted in the atmosphere. It was like a room that had belonged to your family for generations, suddenly rented out to strangers who acted as if you were never there. In the weeks that followed, the machinery of occupation smoothly clicked into place. Czech newspapers were censored. Jewish shops were marked. German became mandatory in offices. Our editor was dismissed by a man with thin mustache and a list of banned topics. I resorted to writing in code, or not at all. One evening, a colleague named Pavel secretly slipped me a leaflet he had smuggled from Poland. Read this, he said. Tell me if you think it's only about us. The leaflet described a German demand for the city of Danzig and a corridor across Polish territory. It sounded like the Sudeten story, rewritten with a different accent. A chill settled in my chest. The pattern was no longer subtle. It was a deliberate march. In late August 1939, I traveled again, this time as far as Krakow. The Polish streets teemed with summer tourists who pretended not to notice the sandbags surrounding government buildings. People lingered longer than necessary at bakeries, simply to continue talking in public. I interviewed a young Polish mother who lived near the border. Her husband had been called up. She kept folding and refolding a tiny baby blanket, as if by perfecting its corners she could somehow protect her child. We don't want to fight, she said, but we also know what happens when you keep giving away pieces of yourself. Soon there is nothing left. On September 1st, the sky over Krakow was torn open by the sound of sirens. German planes flew overhead like dark, indifferent birds. Bombs fell beyond the city, then closer. The war did not begin with a single shout. It began the way a storm starts. First a pressure change you can't quite define, then a gust that knocks something over, and suddenly the world is running for its life. I ran too, through alleys, through smoke. I saw an old synagogue with shattered windows, a train station packed with people clutching suitcases they might never open again, a boy carrying a violin larger than himself. At the edge of the city, Polish soldiers dug trenches, their hands already blistered. They looked older than their years and younger than their fear. 2 days later, I crossed back into Protectorate on foot, the roads clogged with refugees and carts. Behind us, Poland was ablaze. Ahead of us, Europe was listening, still debating what to call it. That night in a rented room near the border, I wrote the only sentence my shaking hand could manage. The war began long before the first gun fired. In every bargain made with a bully, in every silence sold as peace. Outside, the wind continued to speak. This time, no editor needed to send me to hear it. By the time autumn 1939 faded into winter, the war already had the taste of iron. Yet in Berlin, where my cousin Elise lived, people were still attempting to wrap normal life around a new reality, like a scarf pulled too tight. Elise wrote to me in careful, neutral sentences, letters that smelled faintly of ink and fear. We are told this is necessary, she said. We are told it will be quick. We are told many things. I met her again only in memory, because after Prague fell, we were separated by borders that had begun to behave like walls. Still, her words followed me. They followed everyone. Across Europe, governments spoke in a language of inevitability, as if the future were a train already in motion and citizens were merely passengers asked to keep the aisles clear. Germany pushed west in 1940, sweeping over Belgium and France. The maps in my notebook changed faster than I could redraw them. Refugees poured into any country still open to them, carrying rugs, birds in cages, family photographs, and a strange hope that the next town might be the last place they'd have to run. I reported from the edges, never at the center, always one step behind, because that is where reporters and ordinary people tend to live during war. But when Paris fell, when the British retreated across the Channel, I understood that the war was not a rude interruption. It was becoming a system, an all-encompassing reality. In June 1941, another door slammed shut. Germany invaded the Soviet Union, shattering a pact that was never meant to last. The radio called a crusade. The soldiers called it a march into endless fields. The mothers called it goodbye without knowing to whom they were saying it. I heard these voices in stations and bread lines in the quiet of nights when trains kept moving east, packed with men and promises. Around that time, I began paying closer attention to the dispatches coming from Asia. At first, Europe treated those headlines like distant weather. Storms over China, typhoons in Manchuria. Japan had been at war since 1937, consuming cities along China's coast with slow, brutal hunger. But now Japan was tightening its grip on Indochina, on the Dutch East Indies, on the routes that fed its empire with oil and rubber. Western powers responded with embargoes. Japan responded by making new calculations. I didn't know, then, that the war had already become global in the minds of a handful of men in Tokyo. While Europe was burning, conference rooms in Japan filled with maps of the Pacific, arrows sweeping south and east. Their question was not if they would fight the United States or Britain, but when and how to strike first. In late 1941, I was in a neutral city, Lisbon, because neutrality was one of the few ways a journalist could remain mobile. Lisbon felt like a theater lobby during intermission. Diplomats murmured in corners, spies exchanged smiles across cafe tables, and ships in the harbor waited with their lights dimmed. Everyone knew the next act would be much louder. I befriended a Portuguese dockworker named WWII, who had a habit of listening to foreign sailors the way a priest listens in confession. "The Americans think they're far," he said one night as we watched the freighter unload crates marked with unfamiliar letters. "The Japanese think distance is only water. Water can be crossed." On December 7th, 1941, WWII's sentence became prophecy. I woke to frantic knocks on my hotel door. The radio in the lobby blared in several languages at once. Japanese planes had attacked Pearl Harbor. American ships were burning in Hawaii. The United States, still officially outside the European war, had been dragged in by fire. That morning, Lisbon streets fell strangely silent, as if even the city had to pause to absorb the magnitude of the news. In the cafe where I wrote, the usual chess players stared at their boards without moving a piece. A woman at the next table crossed herself. A man behind the counter muttered, "Now it is one war." Within days, the chain reaction spread. Roosevelt asked Congress for a declaration of war. Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. Britain braced for another front. Japan surged through Southeast Asia and the Pacific, seizing Hong Kong, Singapore, the Philippines, islands whose names most Europeans had never learned in school. The world map became a tightening net. I traveled to London in early 1942, navigating checkpoints and blackout curtains. The city was an exercise in gray endurance. People walked quickly under the threat of raids, but they walked nonetheless. A poster in the underground read, "Keep calm and carry on," and I finally understood it not as bravado, but as a recipe for sanity. If your world is falling apart, you still must buy milk, still must kiss your child, still must laugh in the queue, so the war doesn't rob every ounce of joy from your mouth. In a shelter one night, I met a young RAF mechanic, named Tom, who had never seen Prague, yet spoke about it as if he had. "We should have stopped him earlier," he said, rubbing grease from his fingers. "We kept thinking if we gave enough, he'd stop wanting." Turns out wanting was the point. His words transported me back to Munich, to Marta's empty classroom, to the Polish mother with the baby blanket. I saw, with a painful clarity, how the beginnings of the war were not a singular event, but a series of escalations, each one building on the last, each justified as temporary, limited, or local. After Pearl Harbor, no one could feign ignorance about the war's scope. The oceans were no longer buffers, only routes. The war had jumped the walls of continents the way fire jumps hedges in a dry wind. On a foggy afternoon by the Thames, I watched convoy ships pass beneath Tower Bridge, their decks laden with tanks and food, their crews silhouettes in the mist. They were heading to Russia, to Africa, to anywhere the war demanded. The river smelled of coal metal and diesel. I pulled my coat tighter and felt a strange, somber awe. The Second World War had begun because too many people mistook ambition for grievance and delay for peace. It spread because empires collided like trains at full speed. And now, in 1942, it had become what WWII said in Lisbon: one war with 100 faces. I returned to my rented room that night with the sense that the story had moved beyond Europe's borders. The next part, whether I wanted it or not, would be written on seas and in skies far from Prague, and it would pull all of us along. If part one was the moment the match struck, and part two the fire climbing the curtains, part three, though I did not think in metaphors at the time, was the hour the whole house realized it was burning. Early 1942 relentlessly delivered news with a blunt rhythm. In the east, the siege of Leningrad tightened like a fist. In the south, Rommel advanced toward Egypt and the Suez Canal, that vital artery of world trade. On the Atlantic, U-boats hunted beneath the black water. Everywhere, the war was learning new ways to be ubiquitous, to be all-encompassing. I was assigned to follow a convoy route through the Mediterranean. Write about supplies, my editor said, now operating from a cramped office in exile. Write about how people keep breathing. It sounded insignificant against the backdrop of massive armies, but I understood the point. Wars begin with leaders and speeches, but they reside within the lungs of ordinary people, shaping their very existence. In Alexandria, I watched crates of canned meat and machine parts stacked higher than a man. The port was a melting pot of languages: Arabic, English, Greek, French, Polish, and Czech, spoken in hushed reunions. I met a Czech nurse named Hannah, who had escaped through the Balkans and now worked in a British field hospital. She was from Brno and knew of Prague only through rumor for 2 years. "Do you still have streets?" she asked me on our first walk. It wasn't a joke. It was the kind of question war forces you to ask. "Streets, yes," I said, "but they feel narrower." She laughed softly, then grew serious. When they told us in 1938 it was only Sudetenland, I believed them for one afternoon. One afternoon is all it took to lose a country. Her words resonated with me as we moved along the coast under the constant rumble of distant artillery. The war had started with only this, only that, like a man insisting the first punch is harmless. By now, those words had become ash, devoid of meaning. From Egypt, I traveled with a transport plane to Tehran, because the Allies were funneling supplies to the Soviet Union through Persia. On the runway, rows of oil drums glistened in the sun. I spoke with an American pilot, a farm kid from Kansas, who had learned to pronounce Stalingrad before he'd ever seen the ocean. "Funny thing," he said, chewing something that might have been gum or nerves. "Back home, I used to think Europe was a story in books. Now it's where my friends are dying. Guess the world's smaller than we thought." That, too, was part of how the war began, not just through aggression, but through the shrinking of distance by technology, trade, radio, and ambition. Planes crossed what oceans had once mitigated. Tanks rolled over what treaties had once protected. A dictator could speak into a microphone and sway a continent's mood. The 20th century made it possible for one spark to ignite every curtain. In the summer of 1942, I returned briefly to Protectorate under a false work permit because the newspaper needed eyes on the ground. Prague was quieter than I remembered, as if the city had learned to breathe shallowly in order to survive. The cafes still served coffee, but their mirrors were dimmed and their conversations unfolded like careful chess games, each word measured. You could feel the war even when no soldiers passed, like a pressure behind your ears, a constant hum of anxiety. You could feel in the yellow stars emblazoned on coats, in the empty apartments on streets where Jewish families had once thrived, in the way people listened intently before they spoke, weighing their words carefully. I found Marta at last, not in Liberec. She had been transferred, then dismissed, but in a small apartment in Zizkov where she sheltered children who had nowhere else to go, providing them with a haven from the storm raging outside. The room was warm and smelled of potatoes, a comforting aroma in those dark times. 2 boys sat at a table, learning sums from her in hushed tones, their voices barely audible. She recognized me immediately, even though I had grown thinner, and she had aged in a way that photos can never quite capture. "You're still writing?" she asked. "Sometimes," I said. "Mostly I'm watching." "That counts," she replied, and handed me a cup of tea as if war were not raging just beyond her window. We talked at night. When the children were asleep, their dreams hopefully filled with peace. She told me about neighbors disappearing without a trace, about crate trains rolling north toward unknown destinations, about people who still clung to the illusion that this was all temporary, a passing phase. "Temporary is the favorite word of occupiers," she said, her voice heavy with resignation. "They say it until it becomes your life, the new normal." I asked if she thought the war could have been stopped earlier, if a different course could have been charted. She didn't answer quickly, and the silence that stretched between us held decades of unspoken truths, regrets, and what-ifs. "Maybe," she said at last, her voice barely a whisper, "but it would have required courage at a time when everyone craved relief, when the overwhelming desire was for an end to the hardship. People were exhausted after the last war, still reeling from its devastation. When someone offered peace, even a false peace built on lies, they clung to it with desperate hope. I don't blame the tired, the weary souls who yearn for respite. I blame the men who exploited our tiredness, who twisted our desire for peace into a weapon against us. Before dawn, I left Prague again, carrying her words like hidden papers, smuggled truths to be shared with the world. On the road, I passed a column of forced laborers in striped uniforms, their faces gaunt and hollow, guarded by a teenage German soldier whose face was more frightened than cruel, a chilling reminder that the war's genesis had also included the insidious poisoning of young minds, teaching obedience as a virtue and violence as destiny. Back in Cairo, the heat felt surreal, almost dreamlike, a stark contrast to the horrors unfolding across the globe. News arrived that the Germans were at the gates of Stalingrad, poised to seize the city. In the Pacific, the Americans and Japanese fought fiercely at Guadalcanal, each side determined to prevail. Nobody spoke anymore of a quick end, of a swift resolution to the conflict. The war had matured into a monstrous creature that fed on everything. Land, oil, pride, revenge, fear, consuming all in an insatiable hunger. One evening, on a rooftop catching whatever meager breeze the desert would spare, Hannah joined me, seeking respite from the stifling heat. We listened to the radio report casualty numbers, as if they were mere weather statistics, detached and impersonal. "Do you ever think about that first step?" she asked, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "The first deal, the first surrender, the initial compromise that set everything in motion?" "Yes," I said, my voice barely audible. "Too often, the thought haunts me." She nodded, her expression somber. "The strange thing is, beginnings rarely feel like beginnings, like pivotal moments that will alter the course of history. They feel like postponements, like temporary reprieves, like you're choosing the smaller pain, the lesser of two evils. Then one day you look up and the smaller pains, the seemingly insignificant compromises, have gathered into a mountain, an insurmountable obstacle that blocks your path forward. Below us, the city glowed in a muted, blackout shade dimness, a constant reminder of the war that loomed large over their lives. Somewhere in the distance, a band was playing a slow song, a melody not meant to forget the war, but to remember something else alongside it, something that existed beyond the realm of conflict and destruction, a faint glimmer of hope. That was the quiet climax of my understanding, the moment everything crystallized. The Second World War began not as a single cataclysmic event, but as a long, insidious chain of human choices. Fearful choices, hopeful choices, selfish choices, exhausted choices, met by leaders who knew exactly how to exploit them, how to manipulate them into permission for further aggression. It began when aggression was rewarded, when victims were asked to be reasonable and accommodating, when distance made suffering easy to ignore, and when people mistook silence for safety, believing that if they remained quiet, they would somehow be spared. And even now, in the thick of 1942, with the world ablaze, people still chose small acts of defiance and compassion. Marta teaching arithmetic to orphaned children, Hannah binding wounds in a field hospital, Rue listening intently at the docks, gathering whispers of information, Tom meticulously fixing planes, ensuring they were ready to fly again. Those acts, however small, did not undo the beginning, but they shaped the ending that one day would come, contributing to the eventual triumph over darkness. The radio continued to broadcast its endless stream of news, and the war continued to spread, engulfing more and more of the world. But on that rooftop, with Hannah beside me and the night holding its breath, I felt the line from the first part continue forward, a reminder that history is not a single door, but many doors, and every time we close one gently to avoid a draft, we must look hard who is quietly opening another, what hidden agendas lie behind our actions, and what consequences our choices will ultimately unleash upon the world.